any event, I wanted to continue on. Yesterday we talked about restoring radios and kind of the approach to doing it, why people do it. I thought you might like to hear about how I restored a very rare and unique radio. It's called a Cosmophone. And you know, the funny thing about collecting radios, again, it comes back to being a kid again. You know, you read all the QSTs, looked at all the ads, and wanted to have every one of these wonderful radios, and you couldn't afford any of them, right? You know, so, but there was one radio that always caught my interest when I looked at the old QSTs and the CQs back in the 50s, late 58 and 59, even up into 1960, was this one radio that was called a Cosmophone. I said, what kind of radio is that? Never had heard one on the air, never had seen one at a ham fest, so I didn't know very much about it except what was in the advertisements. You know, and eventually I actually ran into one. But of course this is my station with the Cosmophone in the middle. I like to restore other rigs. And again, when you're a high school kid looking at all the new radios at the Radio Emporium, the one that always caught my eye, and probably some of the other ones, was this national rig down at the bottom with the digital display. I mean, a digital display in 1965 or so. That was pretty neat. I mean, the only radio I'd ever seen with a digital display was an R390, certainly not a transceiver. So anyway, I did eventually find one and get it working, which is another discussion. Yeah. But in the 1950s, you know, single sideband was slowly but steadily taking root on the HF bands. And again, this symposium, the whole weekend, is this event was dedicated to Wes Shum, the founder of Central Electronics, who's credited with bringing single sideband in affordable form to the radio amateurs. And he built it as a system with an exciter and a device for the receiver so you could actually copy single sideband. And that was in the very early 1950s. But you know, back in the day, the traditional ham radio setup was a receiver, a transmitter, an amplifier, and there were various shapes and sizes, some homebrew, but some of them were store-bought. Collins was the first one to actually market a transceiver, whether it was packaged, the exciter, the radio, the transmitter, and the receiver all in one box. But the KWM-1 only did 3 bands. It wasn't a full band radio. It did 20, 15, and 10 meters. Now, Cosmophone Industries was a company in Long Island City, New York, and it was the first to market what would you consider to be an all-band amateur transceiver. They called it a bilateral radio, simply because Collins had introduced the term transceiver first, so they had to have their own term for it. And they call it bilateral because the signal path was in 2 directions in a very key spot, which happened to be the mechanical filter. So it was first introduced in 1958, and the first ad for it was in CQ magazine. There was supposed to be an initial production run of 100 units. You know, because Cosmos Industries, they were a company that built contract pieces for the federal government. In fact, if you look at some of the early R390s and 390As, you'll find that Cosmos Industries built the VFOs for those. So they did it. In fact, some people claim that it actually were better than the Collins VFOs. I don't know about that. I've actually had 2 radios with both. They both seem to be pretty good to me. So.
I think it was easier to adjust the linearity.
Right, it was. Yeah, that's the big thing, because the Collins VFO has like a stack of little plates that make like a Hill and Dale track that a tracking corrector rides on. And I guess they had a way of doing that in the factory, aligning it. What's a really interesting one was the linearization of the VFO in a TMC transmitter. It has a big giant cam with set screws that ride, that have like a beryllium strip. And I don't know how they adjusted this in the factory, but they did, and they got it linearized. It was a pretty neat thing. Anyway, of the 100 radios, only about 30 of them are known to exist today. I didn't know 2 of them were at a friend of mine's warehouse in Texas, so that's news to me. But a number of them were damaged in a plant fire at Cosmos Industries, so those never did get out. 10 of them were converted to Cosmophone 1000s, and we'll explain a little bit why that happened. But they actually took 35s and then brought them back in the assembly line, so to speak, if you wanted to call it that, with only 100 radios. There wasn't much of an assembly line. And they actually built a conversion to make them into a 1,000-watt radio. So this box, the same size box as a Cosmophone, which is about like this, had a pair of 4CX300s in the final, in the 1,000-watt version. The Cosmophone 35, though, only used a single 6146. But it was extremely advanced at its time, but it was also quite expensive, as we'll talk about. What's interesting about the Cosmophone 35 was it actually had 2 dual VFOs built into it, which is kind of neat. So you could switch from VFO A to B from a front panel switch, and you could transceive on either A and VFO A, transceive on VFO B, or you could work split either way, which that was the first radio of its type that did that. And these VFOs were very stable. After I've restored mine, I've been amazed that you could turn it on, listen to a station, and come back an hour and a half later, and it hasn't moved. I mean, it's remarkably stable. It doesn't use a PTO. It actually uses a capacitive tuned VFO. So it doesn't use an inductor. It's not a permeability tuned oscillator. Now, the bottom line is these sets cost too much. When they were introduced, to buy a Cosmophone 35 with a power supply, it cost about $950 in 1958. And that was a lot of money for the average ham just to chew on. The other thing, it has only used a single 6146. So it only delivered, well, how about that, 35 watts. That's why it's got its name. The reason it delivers such low power is because the plate voltage on the tube was so low, and also because it used a network, didn't use a traditional pi network output. It used a network that was made by the National Radio Corporation, and it was only designed for about 40 watts. They made a different version later on that would do 150, but it wasn't available at the time that Cosmos Industries introduced this set. Now, size-wise, the thing's about the size of a 75A4. So here you are, you got the 75A4 size transmitter, transceiver. But then Collins introduces the KWM2. And that just killed it. Because the KWM2 looked pretty, it was small, it was attractive. You could put it in your living room and your wife wouldn't raise 40 kinds of hell about it. You know, it was a really nice looking rig. So it was just too late. It came out too late. And so that, it didn't make any traction. And then when the 1000 came out, well, it was just too little too late. So the Cosmos radios, the Cosmophones, are extremely rare. Since only 30 of them are known to be, exist, and very few of those actually operate. So that, you know, us collectors like to go after things that are unusual. You know, you go through certain phases of collecting. The first phase is, well, I just want to see if I'm really interested in this. Second phase is you start collecting all the rigs that you lusted over as a kid and get them on the air. And the third and final phase is you want to start collecting the really obscure, unusual radios, and just, I guess, for bragging rights, who knows. So in my 50 years, I hadn't seen one except at the W9DYV event up in Jonesboro, Tennessee. Fella brought 2 of them, Brian Harris, who is considered to be the Cosmophone collector. I think single-handedly, he's trying to identify and collect every Cosmophone that exists in the world. And it's not so daunting a task, since less than 50 of them really are probably out there. And I'm very happy to say that I know 3 hams, my good friends that happen to be Cosmophone enthusiasts, myself included. But David's got one, my neighbor, and Joseph, W-A-5-E-I-J, who's a frequent check-in artist on the vintage, or the Boat Anchors Unlimited net on 3870 on Wednesday night. The 3 of us have them. I'm the first one to get mine to work, and I'm putting pressure on my neighbor to get on his. So we're in the Royal Order of Cosmophonists. There's actually a certificate that has been made and circulated amongst us that have working Cosmophones. Now, the unit on the left, this one under the red hat, is mine. That's the one I bought at the Jonesboro convention conference. The one over here is the one that Joseph bought, and David got another one that I wasn't even aware of. But that's the condition it was in when I got it. This is what it looks like and operates today. Now, it was really a unique set the way it was built. You know, first off, it uses a copper chassis just like the Drakes do, but it's extremely heavy. It's not very thin. It's certainly not lightweight. But they divided the stages up into shielded sections, which is kind of neat, and it's very easy to service it. Going from left to right, the PA is on the left. That's in this first area here. Then the balance mixers here, the heterodyne oscillators there, the receiver mixer, first mixer is here, and the front end is there. You know, and they did that for ease of servicing, which was kind of a nice thing because it required quite a bit to get it to work. Now this is the interior of it. This is that tuning device, the output network I was telling you about that was made by the National Corporation. What's neat about it, it doesn't have a band switch. It's continuously variable tuning. As you tune it from the HF, the 80-meter band to the 10-meter band, there's no band switch. Like it's all done with a variable set of capacitors, these sections here. Kind of neat, different. It has 24 tubes, 34 stages. It uses a Collins 3.1 mechanical filter, so it actually sounds, you know, as far as, I guess it's not excessively broad, but it has a more of a phasing type rig sound to it. And it has the dual VFOs. Now there's a lot of information about this thing on Brian Harris's website. He has a collector's page on the Cosmophone, and also at my CE Multiphase site. There were a three-part article series was an electric radio about Cosmophone. So it talks about the entire history of the Cosmophone product, how it was developed. It actually started development in 1952, which I was quite surprised to hear about. It was originally developed as a marine radio. And then the person that developed it tried to sell the design to Collins Radio. Collins was at the time developing their single-sideband product line. And Collins kind of had a not embedded here thing, you know, because they weren't involved in the design of it, they didn't want to take it on. So eventually, this fellow marketed his design to Cosmos Industry, and that's how it eventually became a product. There's actually a review of it, by the way, in QST in 1958, if you're interested in it. You know, they had a lot of interesting challenges to look at when you restore a radio like this, because it's really not a production radio. It's more of a prototype. Whenever you start to build anything in quantity, it's hard. It's one thing to make one radio or one design work. It's another thing when you try to construct it when you have all the variables involved in component tolerances to deal with. And that's the manufacturing part of it. Mine is serial number 26, and it had some design problems that it just didn't work correctly. One stage in particular, You know, it has to share stages for both transmit and receive. And the signal path goes through the mechanical filter in both directions. They relied on biasing off one stage for the transmit side so you could actually receive. Problem is, the way they did it, even though the tubes were cut off with a high degree of bias, it actually took screen voltage off the tube also, it still had enough, it depended upon the manufacturer of the mixer tubes, the pentode. If you had different types of tubes, the same tube from different vendors, they were built differently. And sometimes you could get a tube that would cut off correctly and it would work fine. Of course, when I inadvertently destroyed my working tube, I plugged in a tube from RCA and it didn't work right. It started feeding back. Then I tried a GE, same deal. I eventually had to redesign the circuit to get it to cut off completely. But that's kind of the thing that you run into with trying to restore radios that are really prototypes and haven't really had all the bugs worked out. That's what you're going to face dealing with your R8, TR8, in trying to get it worked out, because it really wasn't a fully finished design. It's close, and it may have worked one time back in the factory, but again, to reproduce it and build it in thousands, that may be difficult. But that's what makes this fun, and that's what makes the hobby of restoring vintage radios or prototype radios so much of a challenge. You learn so much by doing it. So when you deal with a restoration, and every one of them is different, first thing you need to do is study it closely to determine how it was supposed to work first. You can't fix anything or redesign anything unless you at least know fundamentally how it was supposed to work in the first place. These will really test your abilities. And that's the fun part about it, you know. So the rule number one in radio restoration, at least my rule, is put down the diddle stick. You're not going to line out a problem. You know, if it doesn't work, if a stage is defective, you can't twist something and make it magically appear to work again. So you really need to systematically break it down and evaluate things. I use oscilloscope. It's your best friend. I talked about this about painting. My Cosmophone 35 did not win any beauty contest when I got it. It was seriously ugly. The cabinet was peeling paint. It looked funky, dirty, nasty. And the first thing that I did was take all the panels off because I knew they had to be refinished. And talked to you about this yesterday, about how to wrinkle finish these panels. There's really good paints today that the home restorer can use to make an old radio look like new again. But again, the one thing that's you absolutely need when you're restoring radios and you're doing a lot of finishing work, go out and buy yourself an old, beat up but usable electric oven. Stick it in your garage so you don't get your wife really mad at you.
Like, etching paint, is that zinc chromate?
Wait a minute, let me think about that.
The greenish yellow stuff?
Yeah, well, no, it's a clear, but it actually etches the metal and adheres to it. So it's a tougher primer that doesn't peel off very easily. And it also has a sandable finish to it, so it builds. So you can sand out any, small imperfections in the finish. But I always use a good primer like that, because if you just paint over bare metal, it's eventually going to blister off and peel. So, yes.
On the front panel and I guess the back panel of the Cosmophone, is the panel silkscreen or engraved?
It's silkscreen. And the one interesting thing about these Cosmophones, and all the Cosmophones that I've seen so far, and once you start collecting something like this, you never see one, right? You can go 20 years and never see a radio like this. As soon as you buy one, then you start seeing them. It's an amazing thing. It's like they know that you're interested in them. You know, but the one thing that I found is that however Cosmos did the paint job on that front panel, it is rugged. And none of the people that I know that have had these sets have even had to refinish the front panels. They needed to be cleaned and polished, but they didn't need to be rescreened. And you know, you can rescreen these things pretty easily today. You know, with the computer, you can scan the front panel, develop the artwork to do a silk screen. And you'd have to do it in multicolors because there's white, green, and red involved in the screening on this. But, you know, it's easily done. Well, not easily, but it's doable. Let's put it that way. But, you know, I really encourage you, you know, if you're interested in these radios or these types of radios, to get interested in trying to restore a prototype or to find a low production radio, because it is unique and it's a piece of our amateur radio history. You know, there's a number of other sets that you might consider. Eldeco made some really obscure sets that you might consider restoring. But I would encourage you to do it because it is fun and it's very gratifying to take one of these things, a piece of history, and actually get it to work. But that's it. Any questions? When are you going to start? David?
Have you ever put your hands on 1,000?
They've only 3 of them are known to exist, and Brian Harris has 2.
The guy in Dallas?
Yes, yeah, yep, yes, yeah. He sent me,
Never touched it.
no, he sent me a picture of it because I was interested how the way they did the conversion. Well, actually, Cosmophone did 2 sneaky things. You know, I have to admit this. They weren't selling the 35 because it only did 35 watts output, but it did 50 watts input. So they came out with a Cosmos 50, which was nothing more than a Cosmophone 35 with a new front panel silkscreen that said Cosmos 50. It was the same set, it just, that's it. They only made a few of those, like less than 10. And then the remainder of the 35s that they had that weren't selling, because the KWM2 was just blowing it out, they took those and converted them, took the PA section out, and then put in a chassis sideways that had the ceramic tubes. And it was another kludge because you got this big box, this is the radio, then you had a power supply that looked like a little doghouse, and it operated the 35. But then you had another one of these that was high voltage for the PA. So it didn't go anywhere, not anywhere. They made 10 of them. They brought them out into the field. Cosmos Industries could see that they weren't selling. They said, send them back. We want them all back. Well, most of them made it back, but 3 of them we know didn't, and they've got homes. So, yep.
What would be the biggest gotchas or, oh shit, I shouldn't have done that?
They shouldn't have done any of it.
Where I look at something and I do something and I'm taking it apart, and I say, later on that night I say, oh shit, I shouldn't have done that. Are there any of those on just general?
Oh, there's lots of that. When you're disassembling something, for example, and you disassemble it in the wrong order, and then it's hard for you to put it back, that's bad news. That's when you really need to have lots of photographs, and it's important to do that. And study it before you disassemble it. You know, for example, I mean, when I was taking apart, and I showed you pictures of that TMC transmitter, that 875-pound monster that I needed, you know, Larry to help me to manhandle it around. There were pieces of, for example, taking the front panels off because I needed to refinish them. Well, how they put this thing together where you had nuts and bolts that were obscured by other pieces, it was just the most bizarre setup I'd ever seen.
Was that German manufactured?
No, it must have been. It must have been Germans imported to the U.S. But no, it's It's just fun, and it challenges you, yeah. It helps to have been involved in liking to rebuild sports cars, let's put it that way, yeah.
One of the things that you are tempted when you get one of these boat anchors is, and you study the schematic of it, you say, what bonehead designed that circuit? And you say, well, you know, I'm just gonna change this and change that and change this. Well, when you do that, you put bumps in the road, and it just doesn't work. You've got to stick with what was originally intended, and then if you're brave enough, once you get it working, then you can do some tweaking to it. But trying to redesign when you're in the process of rebuilding it to get it to work
Nah.
for the first time in 50 years, don't do that.
Especially when everybody involved in it's dead. It makes it very difficult to get additional information.
There's nobody that you can call to ask.
Yeah, no, you're on your own, really. Yeah.
I'm not technical, but working with Nick, I also found one of the best things in the world is forget about checking your pictures in the camera. Take the card out, put it in a computer, use a photograph manipulation program so that you can expand it
Oh,
and
yeah.
see what you're looking at. Because sometimes you just can't tell what's on top of what's on top
Right.
of what.
Yeah, and SD cards get lost pretty easily. So here it is, you got all your valuable photographs in an SD card, and you've somehow misplaced it in a stack of other stuff, or it's gotten shoved into a book, and then you're stuck because then you're trying to recreate something from memory, and your memory's not that good. Especially, you know, like a radio like that, it took me almost a year to get it completely restored and operational. So, you know, what you've done 12 months ago, you're not going to remember then, you know, so. And write down everything, you know, have a diary of what you've done every day, especially when you're trying to troubleshoot it, because you may, this is the thing that I find when I'm rebuilding one of these sets, you know, and especially when it hasn't been operational for a long time, you know, you'll do your troubleshooting and you really find you get stumped, you know. Just write everything down, put it away, go away from it for a day or two, and come back, and it's amazing you'll have the answer. I don't know what it is, but I think it just, if you relax, it seems like the answer comes to you. Yeah.
It's going to be interesting to see. I have serial number 12. What are you on, Richard? What do you know? You don't know what they are?
No, they're too big to pull out and look around.
Everything we work on is too big to pull out and look around.
If you let me
Yeah.
come pick up those 600Ls, I'll
Yeah.
pull them out for you.
That's the nice thing about today's radios. They're so light. I mean, you know, yeah, you can't call them boat anchors 30 years from now. I don't know. We'll have to come up with a new term.
You know, we've got a problem though. All the radios have an LCD display. How many of those LCDs are going to be working in 50 years?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that's a big thing.
These are 957, 897. The ones that segment the lines,
Yeah.
every last one of them's got lines disappearing on.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to it's going to be hard to modernize or restore these radios in the future, especially with processors. How many are you going to get parts for those? You know, yet I can get all the tubes I want for these sets. You know, they haven't been making a tube in the United States since what, 1989, 90, I think is the last that GE one shut down. You know, and you can still buy all kinds of parts for them.
As long as the dies aren't lost, the Chinese will produce all we want
Yeah.
in 50 years.
But David, you're in luck. The Cosmophone uses 6J6s as mixes, a bunch of them. And you can buy them from that tube place for $1 a piece. That's a bargain, yeah. $1 a piece. Yeah, only Cosmophone apparently. Anyway, that's it. Thank you very much, folks.